Get her out of my sight." The man said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Clara Whitmore stood at the gate, her travel bag still in her hand, her letter of introduction folded against her chest, and she did not move. She had ridden 3 days and 2 nights on a mail coach from Ohio to reach Pine Ridge, Wyoming territory. She had one dress left that wasn't wrinkled. She had exactly $4.30. And now the 7th family in 7 days had just told her she wasn't what they were looking for. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, not pretty enough, not small enough, not the right kind of woman, then this story was made for you. Subscribe to our channel and stay with us. What happens next will change the way you see everything. The morning Clara Whitmore arrived in Pine Ridge, Wyoming territory. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains like something with a grudge. It was October of 1888, and the town was not much to look at. A general store, a livery, 2 saloons, a church with a crooked steeple, and enough mud in the street to swallow a boot hole. She stepped off the mail coach before the driver had fully stopped, because she had been sitting for 9 hours and her legs had gone numb somewhere around the 3rd mountain pass. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered, full-figured, with dark hair she'd pinned up herself in the dark of the coach that morning. Her dress was clean but plain. Her boots were worn at the heel. She carried a single travel bag that held everything she owned, and in her coat pocket, folded into quarters, was the letter. The letter was the reason she was here. It had been placed through a correspondence agency out of Columbus, Ohio, the kind that matched women from the East with men in the Western territories who needed wives and couldn't find them locally. The agency had taken her $2 in advance, asked her to write a letter describing her skills and her character, and promised that a placement would be arranged before she arrived. Clara had written honestly. She knew how to manage a household budget. She could preserve food for winter jams, salt pork, pickled vegetables. She had grown up working a small farm in Greene County and knew soil composition, crop rotation, and how to read weather from cloud formations. She could do basic arithmetic fast enough to catch a merchant overcharging her. She could sew, set a broken finger, and slaughter a chicken without making a scene of it. She had not mentioned her figure because the agency had not asked about it. That had been her first mistake. The family who had posted the original inquiry was named Alderman. Caleb Alderman, 41, a wheat farmer outside Pine Ridge with 3 young children and a house that needed a woman in it. The agency letter said he was straightforward, devout, and hard-working. Clara had read it 4 times on the train from Columbus to Cheyenne. She had decided she could work with straightforward and hard-working. She found the Alderman property on the edge of town, introduced herself at the gate, and held out the letter. Caleb Alderman looked at the letter, then looked at her, then looked at the letter again, as if hoping the paper would explain the discrepancy between what he'd imagined and what was standing in front of him. His wife's sister was visiting from Laramie and was standing on the porch behind him. She didn't say anything, but her expression said enough. "You're the woman from Ohio." "Clara Whitmore, yes." A pause that stretched too long. "You're the agency didn't say much about your—" He stopped. Started again. "I was expecting someone a bit more—" "A bit more what, Mr. Alderman?" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. She'd seen it in his eyes the moment he'd registered what she looked like. The decision had already been made before he'd read a single word of her letter. "I appreciate you making the trip," he said, "but I don't think this is going to be the right fit." She took the letter back. She said, "I understand," because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her crumble on his front steps. She walked back to the main road. That was family number 1. The agency, it turned out, had made arrangements with several families simultaneously, a fact they had not disclosed to Clara, and a practice that was not entirely legal, though almost impossible to challenge from 900 miles away. The letter she carried had been sent as a general introduction, meant to be presented to whichever family accepted her first. None of them were in a hurry to accept her. The second family. The Beaumonts took one look at her at the door and said they'd already made other arrangements, which was a lie so transparent that even their children looked away in embarrassment. The Beaumont boy, who couldn't have been more than 8, stared at his shoes while his father invented reasons. The third family, a couple named Greer, were at least honest. Mrs. Greer came to the door herself, looked Clara up and down with the flat assessment of a woman who had no patience for diplomacy, and said, "We need a woman who can work hard outdoors in all weather." "I can do that," Clara said. "A woman who is physically suited to heavy labor." Clara looked at her steadily. "I grew up farming. I've worked heavier land than this." But Mrs. Greer had made her determination and wasn't moving from it. "I don't think you're what we had in mind." "What exactly did you have in mind, Mrs. Greer?" "Someone smaller," she said. As if that were a reasonable answer. As if that made any kind of sense at all. Clara said, "I understand," again because she was running low on alternatives and still had nowhere to sleep that night. She walked back into town. By the fourth family, she had stopped feeling surprised. She had started feeling something colder and harder than surprise. The specific kind of anger that comes when you realize that the wrong being done to you is not personal. It's systematic. Nobody is looking at you. They're looking at the shape of you, the outline of you, the version of you that doesn't match the picture they carried in their head, and they are deciding everything about your worth based on that outline alone. The Mercer family at least had the decency to feel guilty about it. Their oldest daughter, maybe 15, met Clara's eyes from behind her father's shoulder and mouthed something that might have been, "I'm sorry." Clara didn't react. She thanked Mr. Mercer for his time and kept walking. Families 5 and 6 blurred together. Different names, same look. Different doors, same quiet dismissal. Different words arranged into the same fundamental sentence, "You are not what we wanted when we imagined a wife." By the time she reached the 7th property, a man named Hutchins, a livestock dealer on the north end of Pine Ridge. Clara had been on her feet for 4 hours in the cold, with her travel bag cutting into her palm. Hutchins opened the gate and didn't even pretend to consider it. "No," he said, before she had finished introducing herself. "No, I don't think so." She stood there. For a moment, she did not move. She had exactly $4.30. She had no ticket back to Ohio. She had no family to wire for help. Her parents were gone. Her brother had his own problems, and the cousin in Columbus, who'd encouraged her to try the agency, had done so with the enthusiasm of someone who had never had to stake her future on a stranger's decision. Clara had made this trip because it was the only door she could find open, and now she was standing in front of the 7th closed gate in one day, and the wind off the mountains was picking up, and she was out of options. She did not cry. She had not cried once that day, and she was not going to start now standing in front of a livestock dealer who hadn't even asked her name. She looked Hutchins directly in the face. "Have a good evening," she said. She turned and walked. The main street of Pine Ridge was mostly empty by mid-afternoon. A few horses tied outside the saloon. A woman hurrying past with a basket. 2 old men sitting outside the general store watching the wind move trash across the road, with the satisfied boredom of men who had exhausted every other form of entertainment. Clara sat down on the steps of the post office, which was closed, and put her bag on the ground beside her and thought. The thinking did not produce any immediate solutions. She had $4.30 a travel bag, a letter that had proven worthless, and a skill set that apparently no one in Pine Ridge, Wyoming territory was interested in verifying before rejecting her. She was 900 miles from anything familiar. The temperature was dropping. She had not eaten since 6 that morning. She was still thinking through her extremely limited options when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her and a horse being walked slowly, rather than ridden, and she looked up to see a man leading a bay horse and carrying a paper sack of goods from the general store, and he had stopped. How was tall. Not theatrical about it, the kind of tall that was just how he was built, same as he was broad through the shoulders, and had hands that looked like they'd been worked hard for a long time. He had dark hair showing at the edges of his hat, and 3 or 4 days of beard, and the particular expression of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors and had learned to notice things because noticing things kept you alive. He was looking at her. Not the way men had been looking at her all day, not sizing her up, not calculating, not deciding. Just looking the way you look at something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of a normal afternoon, and you're trying to understand why. "You've been walking up and down this street for most of the day," he said. It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. I've been making calls. I know. I saw. A pause. He tied the horse to a post with a single practiced loop. I saw 7 of them. She didn't say anything. I'm not asking for details, he said. I'm just saying I was watching and I saw and I didn't like what I saw. Most people in this town seem to find it very entertaining. Most people in this town don't have anything better to do than watch other people fail. He set the paper sack down on the step above her. Do you have somewhere to go tonight? Not yet. Do you have money for the hotel? She considered lying about this and decided against it. No. He pushed his hat back slightly, which seemed to be a gesture he made when he was thinking. My name is Wyatt Cole. I have a ranch about 8 miles up into the hills. It's not much. It's not in good shape. It has 1 room that's not being used. He looked at her directly. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a situation that might be useful to both of us if you're willing to hear it. Clara looked up at him. He was standing in the late afternoon light with a paper sack of provisions and a patient horse. And he was looking at her the way nobody else had looked at her all day, as if she were a person who might have useful things to say. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you spent a full day being turned away by people who didn't ask you a single question before they made up their minds. I know you didn't break down and you didn't make a scene. And I know you're still sitting here thinking of a plan instead of waiting for someone to rescue you. He picked up his sack. That tells me something. It doesn't tell you whether I'm any good at ranch work. So tell me. She told him. She told him about Greene County. About the farm her father had worked until his joints gave out, and the 3 years she'd run it herself before the bank took it. About the preserving and the budgeting and the soil work and the livestock they'd kept 4 cows and a dozen chickens and a bad-tempered goat named Erasmus, who had eventually eaten her mother's apron and been forgiven for it. She told him about the winter of 1885, when they'd lost half the root cellar to rot, because her father had stored the turnips wrong, and how she'd rebuilt the storage system from scratch the following year, so it wouldn't happen again. Wyatt Cole listened. He didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he said, My ranch is going under. Slowly, but it's going under. I know cattle, and I know this land. But the management side, the accounting, the provisioning, the storage. I've been doing it badly for years, and I don't have a good excuse for that, except that I've been trying to do everything alone. Why do you need a wife instead of just a hand? Because I can't afford a hand. And because a hand won't stay through the winter for room and board, and a share of whatever we manage to save. And a wife will. I'm not offering marriage, he said clearly. Not today. I'm offering a roof and food and fair treatment while we see if this is something that makes sense for both of us. If it doesn't work, I'll drive you back to town myself and see what I can do about getting you a ticket east. Clara looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He did not fidget. He did not try to fill the silence with reassurances or flattery. He just waited with the stillness of a man who had learned that waiting was usually more honest than talking. You saw 7 families turn me away, she said slowly, and your response was to offer me work. Not charity. Work. What made you stop? I was quiet for a moment. Then, because I've been the person people decided about before they knew anything about me. Not for the same reason, but the feeling's familiar. He put his hat back level. And because I needed a reason to stop walking past. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her all day. All right, Mr. Cole, she said, and stood up and picked up her bag. Show me what you've got. The ranch was 8 miles up a track that only generously deserved the name road. It was the kind of terrain that tested both the horse and the resolve of anyone sitting in the cart behind it. Switchbacks that cut across the face of the hills. Creek crossings where the water ran fast and cold, over loose rock stretches where the pines grew so thick on either side that the light dropped to almost nothing even in the afternoon. Clara watched the land and said very little. She was categorizing. It was a habit she'd developed during the farm years. When you encounter a new piece of land, you read it before you try to work it. You look at how the water drains. You notice where the trees grow thick and where they thin out, because that tells you about wind and about soil depth. You look at the rock formations and think about what's underneath. What she saw here was hard country, but not dead country. It had gone neglected, that was clear. But neglected wasn't the same as ruined. The ranch house itself was small, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, combined a bedroom and what had been a storage room that Wyatt had cleared out and put a narrow cot in. The outbuildings were a barn, a smokehouse that had seen better days, and a root cellar cut into the hillside. Wyatt opened the door and let her walk in first. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned around once slowly. She saw the problem immediately. Not one problem, a cascade of them all connected, all feeding into each other like water finding the lowest point. The food storage was disorganized. She could see from the placement of the sacks and barrels that things were being stored by convenience rather than by logic, which meant she'd find spoilage. The stove had a draft issue, which meant it was burning more wood than it needed to and producing less heat. The window seals were failing, which meant heat loss through the winter. These were not catastrophic problems. They were management problems, the kind that compound slowly over months and years, until a man can't figure out why he's always short. Short on money, short on heat, short on provisions, when the individual pieces seem like they should be adding up differently. "How long have you been running this place alone?" she asked. 4 years. And before that, my father ran it, with my mother and 2 brothers. What happened to them? My mother died in '79. My father sold up after that and moved east with my brothers. He offered me half the value of the land to come with him. He paused. I didn't want to go east. So you stayed and bought out his half? Something like that. Took on debt to do it. How much debt? He told her. It was a larger number than she'd expected, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not alarm exactly, but the kind of recalibration that comes when you realize the situation is more serious than the surface showed. The supplies from town, she said. Where are you buying? Morrison's General Store, same as everyone else. What do you pay for salt? He told her. That's 30% over market, she said. He's been overcharging you. Wyatt stared at her. I priced salt at 4 different merchants when I was traveling through Cheyenne, she said. And in Casper, and in Douglas. Morrison is charging you significantly more than prevailing rate. She looked around the room again. What else are you buying from him? He listed the items. She put a rough figure on each one. By the time they reached the end of the list, the number sitting between them was significant money. He'd been losing month after month, not because of bad luck or bad land or bad cattle, but because nobody had been watching the numbers. Wyatt sat down slowly in the chair by the table. He had the look of a man who had just been told something that should have been obvious to him years ago and was trying to decide whether to be relieved or ashamed that it hadn't been. You figured that out in 10 minutes, he said. I figured out the salt in 10 seconds. The rest took a bit longer. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Mr. Cole, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly. All right. Are you a man who can be told he's doing something wrong without making the person who told him regret it? He was very still for a moment. Then something in his face moved, not quite a smile, but close to it. I like to think so, he said. Though I'd rather have evidence than my own opinion. Fair answer. She put her hands flat on the table. Here is what I can see in this room alone in the first hour. You have a storage problem that's costing you in spoilage. You have a supply chain problem that's costing you in price. You have a heat management problem that's costing you in fuel. And you have a cash flow problem that is the direct result of those 3 problems compounding on each other over 4 years. She met his eyes. None of this is unfixable, but you need someone who can manage the operational side so you can focus on the land and the cattle, which is clearly where your ability lies. And that someone is you. I'm suggesting we find out. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the stove was doing its inefficient best. Outside, the wind off the mountains was beginning to carry the first promise of what the winter would eventually deliver. Tomorrow morning, he said, I'll show you the root cellar and the barn accounts. Tonight, she said. Show me tonight. Winter doesn't wait for morning. He looked at her again, and this time something in his expression settled the particular look of a man who has just registered fully and without reservation that he is in the presence of someone who knows what they're doing. He stood up and reached for the lantern. "Tonight then," he said. The root cellar was worse than she'd feared, and better than she'd prepared herself for, which meant it was roughly as bad as the realistic middle of those two positions. Half the turnips were soft. A portion of the dried beans had gotten moisture and were starting to go. The smoked meat was fine. Wyatt had done that right at least, but the layout of the cellar meant that the sections that stayed coldest were being used for goods that didn't need cold, and the sections that warmed first were holding goods that would spoil fastest. She told him all of this standing in the cellar with the lantern between them. He listened. He did not argue. He did not explain away any of it. "How long to fix it?" he asked. 2 days to reorganize fully. We'll lose some of what's already gone soft, but we can save most of it. And the cost of what we can't save. More than you want to know tonight. She held the lantern up to look at the back corner. But less than the cost of not reorganizing and losing the rest of it by February. He nodded once. A man who understood that there is a point in assessing damage where the calculation tips from grief over what's lost to determination about what can still be saved. They were in that cellar for almost 2 hours. When they came back up, the night had gone fully dark, and the wind was harder than it had been at sunset. Wyatt built the fire up while Clara went through the kitchen supplies with the same methodical attention she'd given the cellar. When she finally sat down at the table with a cup of the coffee he'd made, she had a mental list that was long enough to be daunting, specific enough to be actionable, and organized by priority, in a way that her father had always called Clara's greatest professional gift, and her most personally irritating characteristic. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She told him. It took half an hour. He asked good questions, practical, specific. The questions of someone who understood the land and the work, even when he'd been missing the management layer underneath. They argued briefly about the livestock feed allocation, which he thought was adequate, and she thought was producing unnecessary waste at the back end of the process, and neither of them moved fully to the other's position, but both moved slightly, which was the kind of productive outcome that Clara had learned to consider a success. By the time the coffee was gone and the fire had settled, they had the rough shape of a plan. "I'll need to go to town in the next week," she said. "Not Morrison's. I want to look at what prices are available through the supply agent in Sheridan." "That's 30 miles. "I know, but if his prices are better by even 10%, the trip pays for itself inside of a month." He looked at her across the table. The firelight made everything look more settled than it probably was. "You're serious about this?" "I didn't come 900 miles to do things halfway." Outside, the wind pressed against the house with a particular deliberateness, the way wind does when it wants you to understand that the mountain owns this place and you are merely a guest in it. The log walls held, the fire held, and Clara Whitmore, who had been turned away 7 times in a single day by people who'd decided she wasn't worth looking at twice, sat in the kitchen of a struggling mountain ranch and began quietly, without performance, to figure out how to save it. Wyatt Cole watched her for a moment before he said goodnight. He had been alone on this mountain for a long time. He had come to believe gradually, and without quite noticing, that aloneness was simply what his life was going to consist of. That the kind of person who chose a mountain over everything else was also the kind of person the world eventually stopped offering things to. He wasn't sure anymore that he'd been right about that. He blew out his lamp and left her to her thinking. And Clara Whitmore sat alone at that table for another hour. Not because she had run out of ideas, but because she had too many of them and needed to put them in the right order. Before morning came and the work began. She was not naive enough to think one good conversation had settled anything. She had a roof over her head for one night. She had a man who had listened to her, which was more than 7 others had bothered to do. But listening and trusting were 2 entirely different things, and she had learned the hard way over years of being the woman people underestimated that you didn't get to trust by talking about what you could do. You got it by doing it in front of people, where they could see the results with their own eyes and couldn't argue with the numbers. She needed to produce results fast. Not in a month, not in 2 weeks. Fast. She blew out her own lamp just past midnight and lay down on the narrow cot in the storage room that smelled of cedar and old rope, and she told herself she would sleep 6 hours and not a minute more. She slept 5.5, which was close enough. Wyatt was already up when she came out of the storage room. He had coffee on the stove and was standing by the window with a cup in his hand, looking out at the gray pre-dawn light, with the expression of a man working through a list of problems he'd been carrying for so long he'd stopped noticing the weight of them. He turned when he heard her. "There's coffee," he said. "I know, I can smell it." She poured herself a cup and came to stand at the other end of the table. "I want to see the barn accounts before we do anything else this morning." "Good morning to you too, Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. He wasn't annoyed. There was something almost dry in his voice. The faint ghost of a man who still had a sense of humor, even when his ranch was failing around him. She found herself adjusting her approach slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. I would like to see the barn accounts when you have a moment." "That's not much better." "It's the best I have before 7 in the morning." He almost smiled. He set his cup down, went to the shelf beside the door, and pulled down a battered wooden box that had Cole branded into the lid in uneven letters, the kind of marking that suggested it had been done by someone learning to use the branding iron and practicing on whatever was available. He put the box on the table and pushed it toward her. Clara opened it. Inside was 4 years of financial record-keeping, which was to say, 4 years of paper scraps receipts with numbers written in pencil that had faded to near illegibility. 2 leather-bound ledgers that were only partially filled in, and a collection of loose bills and invoices that had been stuffed into the box in roughly chronological order, which was admirable in intent, if not in execution. She did not say anything. She simply pulled out the nearest ledger and opened it. Wyatt sat down across from her and drank his coffee and watched. She went through the first ledger in 40 minutes. By the time she set it down and picked up the second, she had made a page of notes in her own small, precise hand, and her coffee had gone cold, and she hadn't noticed. When she finished the second ledger, she was quiet for a moment. "When did you last make a payment on the loan?" she asked. "August." "Which loan, the one through the bank in Sheridan, or the private note?" He went very still. "How do you know about the private note?" "Because the payment entries in March and June of '87 don't match any of the bank rates you've been paying, and the amounts are uneven in a way that suggests they were negotiated informally rather than through an institution." She looked up. "I'm not prying. I'm trying to understand the full picture." I was quiet for a moment that stretched in an uncomfortable direction. Then, Edgar Hollis. He owns the lumber yard and 3 other properties in Pine Ridge. I borrowed $200 from him in '86 when the bank wouldn't extend my line. At what rate? 12%. That was high. Not devastating, but high, and it added a dimension to the financial picture that made several of the puzzling entries in the ledger suddenly make sense. She wrote it down. "Is Hollis a straightforward man?" "He's a businessman." A pause. "The kind who keeps careful track of what people owe him." She noted the particular way he said that, not with open hostility, but with the measured caution of someone describing a person he'd learned not to trust more than necessary. "I'll need to know the exact terms," she said. "Interest schedule, repayment conditions, any clauses about what happens in case of default." "I have the note somewhere. Find it today, before anything else." She set down her pen. "Mr. Cole, I want to tell you something that may be uncomfortable. You've been fairly comfortable with the uncomfortable so far. Your ranch is not in the condition I expected based on what you told me last night. It's in worse condition." He didn't flinch. He just looked at her steadily, and she had the sense that he had known this already somewhere below the level where a man admits things to himself. And that part of what had stopped him yesterday on the main street of Pine Ridge was not entirely selflessness. He had needed something to change. He'd just needed it to arrive in a form he could accept. "How much worse?" he asked. "If things continue the way they're going, you're looking at losing the property by next spring. Not because the land is bad or the cattle are bad. Because the operating losses are compounding faster than the revenue can offset them." She kept her voice level. "The good news is that this is a management problem, not a structural one. The land is viable. The herd is smaller than it should be, but it's healthy. The infrastructure is aging, but functional. Everything I'm seeing is fixable. But it needs to be fixed now, not gradually, not when it's convenient. Now through this winter, so that by spring you have a foundation to build from instead of a hole you can't get out of." He put both hands flat on the table. He had the hands of a man who'd worked outdoors for 20 years. The knuckles slightly enlarged, the skin rough and weathered. She noticed, not for any sentimental reason, but because a person's hands told you how they worked and whether they worked hard. His hands said he worked very hard. "Tell me what needs to happen first," he said. What needed to happen first was the root cellar, and they did it that same morning, starting just after dawn, working steadily without much conversation, because the work didn't require conversation. It required moving things, sorting things, discarding what was past saving, and reorganizing what wasn't. Clara directed, and Wyatt moved, and she noted without making it a point of discussion that he followed her directions without questioning them, which was not something she'd taken for granted. She'd worked alongside men who couldn't follow a woman's directions without inserting a comment, a suggestion, a small correction designed to remind everyone present that they retained authority, even when they were the less informed party in the room. Wyatt Cole was not that kind of man. He asked clarifying questions when he needed to, practical ones specific to the task, and otherwise simply did what needed doing. By noon, they had lost 30% of the root vegetables to soft rot, which was painful, but expected, and salvaged the rest in a reorganized layout that Clara walked him through carefully so he'd understand the reasoning and be able to maintain it. "These go in the back corner," she explained. "It stays coldest there, and these are the goods you're least likely to need quickly, so you want them preserved longest. These come forward, you'll access these weekly, so they need to be easy to reach. And these," she pointed to the dried goods she'd moved to the shelf closest to the entrance. "These go here because they're the least temperature sensitive, and putting them in the cold corner was a waste of the cellar's best resource." He looked at the reorganized cellar. "That seems obvious now that you say it." "Most things do. That's not a criticism. It means the principle is sound." He looked at her sideways, not quite a smile, but close to one. "You're careful with people." "I try to be honest without being cruel. Those two things are not the same." They went back inside for coffee, and the first real conversation about the plan, not the overview she'd given him the night before, but the specific sequence of actions week by week that she believed would move the ranch from its current precarious state towards something that could actually sustain itself. She had it organized into 3 phases. She walked him through each one. He listened with the kind of attention that told her he was not just hearing the words, but actually thinking about them, which was far rarer than it should have been in her experience. When she finished laying out the first phase, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "The supply run to Sheridan. That's the most urgent. First priority. If we can get the provisioning costs down before the deep winter, everything else gets easier. That's a 2-day trip each way." "I know. I can't leave the cattle for 4 days." "I'm not asking you to." She looked at him evenly. "I'll go." A pause. "Alone. Unless you plan to come with me, yes." Miss Whitmore, Sheridan is 30 miles through mountain territory in October. The weather could. I drove a farm wagon through a January ice storm in Ohio when I was 19 to get a veterinarian because we had a cow in distress that represented 6 months of the farm's income. 30 miles in October is not beyond my capabilities." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the calculation of whether this was recklessness or competence, whether insisting she take someone with her would be prudent caution, or a patronizing overestimation of the dangers and a patronizing underestimation of her. "I'll think about it," he said. "Think fast. We have a window before the first hard snow." What happened next was not something Clara had planned for, because it came from outside the ranch, from the town, which she had walked away from the day before and had not expected to walk back into so soon. 3 days after she arrived at the Cole ranch, a woman appeared at the property line on horseback and called Wyatt's name. Clara was in the kitchen working through the supply inventory when she heard the voice. She went to the door and looked out. The woman was perhaps 35, well-dressed for the territory, with a composed and watchful face, and the posture of someone who'd decided long ago to take up her full amount of space in any room she entered, which Clara recognized because she'd had to make the same decision. Wyatt came from the barn. The woman dismounted before he reached her. Nora. His voice was neutral in a way that was itself a kind of information. I heard you had a visitor. The woman's eyes moved past Wyatt and found Clara in the doorway. The look was direct and assessing, and over in a second. The girl from the agency. Her name is Clara Whitmore. I know her name. I've been hearing it since yesterday morning. She looked back at Wyatt. Half the town is talking. Half the town doesn't have enough to do. Wyatt. Something shifted in her voice, not quite pleading, but moving in that direction. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because Greta Mercier said you brought her up the mountain in your cart, and Greta Mercier tells everyone everything she sees, and I thought you should know that people are saying, I don't particularly care what people are saying. You should care. You have a loan with Edgar Hollis. Edgar Hollis cares what people say about his borrowers. She said it plainly, without drama, in the manner of someone delivering information they believe is important, regardless of whether the recipient wants to hear it. If he decides your situation is irregular, he has a clause in that note that lets him call the debt early. Clara stepped down from the doorway. Both of them turned. You've read the note? Clara asked. The woman looked at her with frank curiosity. Edgar Hollis is my uncle, she said. And you are not at all what I expected. What did you expect? Based on what Greta Mercier said, someone weeping in a corner. She tilted her head slightly. That's not what I'm seeing. No, Clara agreed. It isn't. A silence stretched between the three of them. Wyatt looked between the two women with the expression of a man who has suddenly realized he may be the least significant party in a conversation that started out being about him. What's in the early repayment clause? Clara asked directly. Specifically. Nora looked at her for another moment. Then, apparently making a decision about Clara that Clara had not been consulted about, but seemed to have passed, she said. If Edgar determines at his sole discretion that the borrower's circumstances have materially changed in a way that increases the risk of default, he can call the full amount due within 90 days. And bringing a woman to the property counts as a material change. It might not. But Edgar is careful. He'll be watching. She paused. He's been watching this property for a while. Clara looked at Wyatt. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, which she'd come to recognize over 3 days as the way he looked when something made him angry that he wasn't sure he was allowed to be angry about. How long has he been watching? Clara asked. It was Wyatt who answered, and the flatness in his voice said more than the words did. Since I took the loan. Has he ever looked at buying the property? A pause. Then Wyatt said very quietly. He made an offer once, 2 years ago. What did you say? I said no. Clara turned back to Nora. Thank you for coming. You've given us important information. Nora looked at her with something that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but might eventually become both. You're going to try to fix it. We're going to fix it. That's... Nora stopped, started again. That's a large amount of confidence for someone who's been here 3 days. 4 days tomorrow. Clara met her eyes steadily. And confidence isn't the word. It's assessment. I've looked at the numbers, I've looked at the land, and I've looked at the problems. They're all fixable. What's not guaranteed whether we have enough time before someone with a financial incentive to see this property fail decides to create a reason for it to fail faster. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone has said something that everyone in the conversation already knew, but no one had said plainly. Nora looked at Wyatt. She's right, you know. I know, he said. Edgar won't do anything obvious. He never does. But he'll be looking for a reason. She mounted her horse with the easy confidence of a woman who'd been riding since childhood. I shouldn't be telling you this. Why are you? Clara asked. Nora looked down at her. Because Caleb Alderman turned you away at his gate and then sat in the saloon that evening talking about it for laughs. And I've known Caleb Alderman for 15 years, and he is not the kind of man who deserves to be right about anything. She gathered her reins. Good luck, Miss Whitmore. She rode back toward the road without looking back. Wyatt stood watching her go. Then he turned to Clara, and the expression on his face was complicated in ways that didn't resolve quickly. "That's Nora Hollis," he said. "Edgar's niece. Her husband died 4 years ago. She manages his properties for him. She's sharp. She's the sharpest person in Pine Ridge, which means she's also the most dangerous depending on where her interests land." He looked at Clara. "I'm not sure I know where they land today." "Today they landed with us," Clara said. "That's what matters today." She turned back toward the house. "Come inside. We need to talk about the repayment clause, and we need to do it now, because if Edgar Hollis is looking for a reason, then the single best thing we can do is make sure the numbers are moving in the right direction before he finds one." Wyatt followed her inside, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara noticed that he was following her without hesitation. Not because he'd been told to, but because he'd made a decision that she was the right person to follow on this particular road. The trip to Sheridan happened 5 days later. Wyatt drove the cart because he had decided that the 30 miles through mountain territory in October were not something he was comfortable sending anyone else through alone, and Clara did not argue the point because she'd made her argument once, and he'd made his decision, and she respected the fact that his decision came from a different kind of care than the patronizing overprotection she'd been bracing for. She spent most of the drive with a notebook in her lap and a pencil in her hand, writing out the supply list in order of priority and cross-referencing it against the prices she'd recorded from her travels east. The cart moved at a steady pace. The mountains rose on either side of the track, and the sky was the flat, bright blue of high-altitude October, and the air had a cold edge in it that meant something was coming. "There's weather in about a week," she said, not looking up from her notebook. He glanced at the sky. 10 days, maybe 12. "I'll say 8. The cloud formation over the North Ridge this morning was. I've been reading weather on this mountain for 10 years. And I've been reading weather my whole life. We can compare notes in 8 days and see who was right." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't back down. I back down when I'm wrong. I don't back down because someone else has more confidence in their own opinion." She finally looked up. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. And then after a pause that had something genuine in it, "It's actually a relief." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the track ahead, but she could see something in his profile, the slight loosening of a man who'd been carrying something tightly for a long time and had just for a moment set it down. "I've spent 4 years making decisions alone," he said, "and I'm good at some of them, but the ones I'm bad at—" He stopped. "Having someone push back is it's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I'm not sure I expected anything. I didn't think through yesterday. I just stopped." "On the street in Pine Ridge?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about what it cost a man who kept his own counsel and lived alone on a mountain to admit that he had acted on something other than calculation. "You said on that street that you'd been the person people decided about before they knew anything about you." She kept her voice even. "What did you mean?" He didn't answer immediately. The cart rolled over a rough patch, and she grabbed the sideboard without losing her grip on the notebook. "My father wanted me to go east with him when he sold the ranch," he said finally. "I said no, so he told everyone in town that I was too stubborn to know when I was beaten, and that I'd lose the property inside 2 years." A pause. "That was 4 years ago. Did it affect your credit?" "The things he said. The bank in Sheridan wouldn't extend my line the following spring. Whether that was because of what my father said, or because of legitimate risk assessment." He shook his head slightly. "I'll never know which." "That's why you went to Hollis." "That's why I went to Hollis." Clara turned this over. The private loan at 12%, the early repayment clause. The man who had been watching the property since the moment money changed hands. "A story with more structure to it than bad luck. Hollis has been waiting for you to fail," she said. "He made the loan knowing the rate was high enough to keep you under pressure." "Probably." "Does he know you know that?" "He knows I'm not stupid. We just both know that knowing it doesn't change the terms of the note. It changes the strategy," Clara said. "If he's been counting on pressure to force a default, then the counterplay is to take the pressure away. Pay down the note faster than he's expecting." on a schedule that doesn't give him time to find a reason to invoke the early repayment clause. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. "What's your current revenue from the herd?" he told her. She wrote it down. "And if we add a preserved goods income stream this winter, the jams, the salt provisions, the dried vegetables conservatively, what could that bring in?" "I don't know. I've never done it." "I have. Conservatively, with the supplies we have and the processing time I can give it, I'd estimate $40 to $60 before spring. Possibly more if the pricing is right." He stared at the road ahead of them. "That's not a small number for this operation," he said carefully. "No, it isn't." She kept writing. "Combined with the savings on the supply costs, if we establish an account in Sheridan at a competitive rate, and if we restructure the feed allocation to reduce waste." She added a column of rough figures and totaled them. "You could make a significant payment on the Hollis note by February. Large enough that even if he wanted to invoke the early repayment clause, the risk calculus on his end would change. Because if the debt is nearly paid, there's nothing to gain by calling it." "Exactly." He was quiet for a long moment. "You worked all this out from 4 years of my paper scraps and 2 days of looking at the cellar. And the conversation with Nora. She gave me the piece I was missing." Clara closed the notebook. "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Cole. This plan works if everything goes reasonably well. If we have a hard winter that kills cattle, or if there's disease, or if the supply costs in Sheridan are higher than I expect, the numbers change. I'm not promising you a miracle. I'm not asking for one. What are you asking for?" He thought about it. "A fair shot." She looked at him. In the flat, bright mountain light with the pines on either side, and the cold air moving around them, and a long stretch of difficult road still ahead. He looked like what he was, a man who had been fighting a losing battle for years, and had only just found someone willing to stand beside him in it. "That," Clara said, "I can do." Sheridan was larger than Pine Ridge by a meaningful margin, and the supply agent there, a brisk, efficient woman named Mrs. Holt, who ran the largest provisioning operation in the county, met Clara with the professional respect that Clara had learned to extract from people who initially looked at her and decided she wasn't worth taking seriously. The method was simple. You asked extremely specific, extremely well-informed questions about pricing and availability and terms. And you asked them in a way that demonstrated clearly that you would recognize a bad answer when you heard one. Mrs. Holt had given Clara a slightly skeptical look at the start of the conversation, and a deeply attentive one by the end of it. They established an account for the Cole Ranch on terms that were, as Clara had anticipated, significantly better than what Morrison was providing in Pine Ridge. She walked out of the provisioning office with the account agreement in her notebook, and found Wyatt waiting outside with the horses, and a look on his face that asked the question without using words. "Better than I hoped," she said. "Worse than the absolute best case. So as expected." He exhaled once. "How much better?" She told him the numbers. He looked at them for a moment. "That's real money," he said. "Yes, it is." He looked at her then, with an expression that Clara did not quite know how to categorize. It wasn't gratitude, which she'd seen plenty of, and which always made her slightly uncomfortable, because it implied she'd done something for him rather than with him. It wasn't surprise, because she'd given him enough evidence by now that surprise was no longer a reasonable response. It was something closer to recognition. The particular look of someone who has found unexpectedly the thing they had stopped knowing how to look for. She looked away before it could become anything she didn't have words for yet. "We need to buy the salt before we head back," she said. "And I want to look at the dried goods prices while we're here." "Clara." She stopped. He'd used her first name. He hadn't done that before. She turned back. "Thank you," he said. Plain and direct, with none of the noise around it that people usually put around gratitude to make it feel smaller. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me in February if the numbers hold." But she was aware, walking toward the dry goods merchant, that something had shifted between that morning and this afternoon. Something small and quiet and significant, in the way that small, quiet things sometimes are when they are the first of a kind. The weather came in 7 days, She had been right, and he had been close, which meant they spent the 8th day of that particular argument looking at each other across the kitchen table, with the wind hammering the walls, and Wyatt said without particular fanfare, 7 days. 7 days, she agreed. And then they both got up and went to work, because there was no time to stand still, and the mountain didn't care who had won the argument about the weather. What mattered was that they were ready when it came, and they were ready when it came. But being ready and being safe were two different things, and the mountain made sure they understood the difference before that first storm was finished. It started the way bad things often do, quietly, without announcement, in the middle of the night, when the only warning was the change in the sound of the wind from something steady to something that meant business. Clara woke at 3 in the morning to silence where there should have been sound, and then too much sound where there should have been silence, and she was out of the cot and into her coat before she'd fully processed what had woken her. Wyatt was already up. She could hear him pulling on his boots in the main room. "The cattle?" she asked, coming through the door. "2 of them pushed through the south fence yesterday afternoon. I didn't get it fully repaired before dark." He was moving for the door. "If they're still out there in this, I'm coming with you." "You don't need to. 2 people find them faster than 1. Stop arguing and let's go." He stopped arguing. What followed was 2 hours in conditions that reminded Clara with considerable force that Wyoming in November was not Ohio in November, and that the mountains had their own particular opinion about human plans. They found the cattle, both of them huddled against the lee side of the rock outcropping on the east slope, which was exactly the kind of instinctive animal intelligence that humans consistently underestimated. Getting them back through the dark and the snow and the wind to the barn required patience that Clara didn't feel, and determination that she did, and by the time the barn door was shut behind the last animal, both she and Wyatt were soaked through and barely functional. They stood in the barn for a moment, breathing hard. "You know how to move cattle in weather," he said. It was not a question. "I told you I grew up farming." "Farming and ranching aren't the same." "No. But cold and dark and animals that don't want to move are the same everywhere." She was wringing water from the end of her braid. "The south fence. Can it hold until morning?" "I put a temporary brace on it before we went out. It'll hold." "Then we need to get inside before we're useless." They went inside. She rebuilt the fire while he changed, and he rebuilt the fire when she came back out from changing, because she'd done it wrong on the first attempt. Too much wood too fast, which produced heat, but burned through the fuel at a rate they couldn't afford. And she let him correct it without comment, because she had been wrong, and there was no useful purpose in defending wrong. They sat across from each other at the table at 5 in the morning, with hot coffee, and the specific exhausted relief of people who have just done something hard and come out the other side of it intact. "The Hollis note," Wyatt said, unprompted. She looked up. "I found the original document. It's in the box. I should have given it to you sooner." He paused. "I didn't because I didn't want to look at it." "I know. You knew I was avoiding it." "I suspected. It's a common response to paperwork that represents something frightening." She kept her voice even. "Avoiding it doesn't change what's in it." "No." He looked at the table. "Read it when you have a chance. There's something in it I didn't understand when I signed, and I've been trying to pretend I didn't notice it since." That was a significant admission from a man who chose his words carefully and did not offer vulnerability easily. She registered it as such. "I'll read it this morning," she said. She did. The clause was on the 3rd page, written in the kind of legal language that was designed to be technically clear and practically obscure, which was a combination that only benefited the person who had written it. Clara read it twice, then read it a 3rd time more slowly, and then sat very still for a moment with the document in her hands. The standard early repayment clause was what Nora had described. Edgar Hollis could call the debt if circumstances materially changed. But there was a second provision beneath it, smaller and set in less prominent text, that had a different character entirely. If the borrower failed to make a payment within 30 days of the scheduled date, Hollis had the right to take title to any improvements made to the property during the loan period, in addition to the principal. The improvements clause. She looked at Wyatt, who was mending a harness by the fire and watching her from the corner of his eye, the way people do when they're pretending not to watch. "You read the whole note before you signed it?" she asked. "I read most of it." "The improvements clause on page 3. He was quiet. "Wyatt, I read it," he said. "I didn't understand it fully." The man from Hollis's office explained it as a standard provision. He paused. "I was $29 away from losing the cattle herd, and I needed the money that day." She understood. She had been in situations where the immediate crisis made the future terms feel abstract, where survival in the next hour was more real than risk in the next year. She did not judge him for it, but she felt the full weight of what it meant land on her chest. If you miss a payment, any payment, he can take everything you've built, not just the land, every improvement. She looked around the room. The repaired cellar, the new storage system, anything we add this winter. Yes. And the next payment is due when? 1st of February. She did the calculation quickly. They had the Sheridan account established. They had the supply savings starting to accumulate. The preserved goods production, she'd begun jams from the last of the autumn fruit salt provisions. Dried vegetables was not finished, and the income from it wouldn't materialize until she could get it to market in town. February 1st was 11 weeks away. 11 weeks to make sure a payment landed on time that would not only satisfy the schedule, but send a message to Edgar Hollis that the coal ranch was not a property he was going to acquire through attrition. "We'll make the payment," she said. "You sound certain." "I am certain." She set the document down carefully, as if it were something that needed to be treated with respect, precisely because it was dangerous. "But I want to understand something. Nora said her uncle has been watching this property. How long has he actually wanted it?" Wyatt set down the harness. "He made his first offer in '85, before my father left." "To your father?" "Yes, my father was willing to consider it. I wasn't. That was part of why my father sold to me instead of to Hollis. He wasn't willing to watch me and Hollis fight over it for the next decade." A pause. "He gave me first right to buy because he wanted the thing settled. And I bought it because I wasn't going to hand it to a man who'd been circling it like a creditor at an auction. But then you needed money, and the bank wouldn't extend your line. And the only person in Pine Ridge with liquid capital who would lend to someone the bank had declined was Hollis." The irony of it was so complete and so brutal that it didn't even need comment. Hollis had created the conditions that drove Wyatt to borrow, and then provided the loan with terms designed to eventually deliver the property he'd wanted from the beginning. Whether that was deliberate strategy or opportunistic alignment of circumstances, the result was the same. Clara thought about Edgar Hollis for a moment. Not with anger, because anger was not useful, but with the clear-eyed assessment she gave to any problem that was structural rather than accidental. He was not a villain in the storybook sense. He was a businessman who had identified a property he wanted and arranged the financial landscape around it, so that the most likely outcome without intervention would be the outcome he preferred. The intervention was her. She hadn't known that when she sat down on the post office steps in Pine Ridge with $4.30 and a worthless letter. But she knew it now. "I need you to tell me everything about this property," she said. "Not the financials, I have those. The history. Who has tried to buy it, who has made offers, what Hollis has said to you directly, and what he's said through other people. Everything." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "That's going to take a while. We have 11 weeks and a bad storm outside. We have time." He told her everything. It took most of the morning, and it was more than she'd expected, a history that went back further than the loan, further than his father's departure, further than Edgar Hollis's first offer. The coal ranch had been in the family for 17 years. It sat on a piece of land that had water rights attached to it, a creek that fed down from the upper mountain and ran through 3 other properties before it reached the valley. Whoever controlled the coal property controlled the water allocation for a significant portion of the area's grazing land. That was the piece she'd been missing. "The water rights," she said when he'd finished. "They're attached to this property specifically, not to the county. Attached to the land grant, my grandfather's original grant from 1871. And if Hollis acquires the property, he controls the water for half the ranches in this county." She sat back. The full picture had just assembled itself in her mind, with the particular clarity that came when the last piece of a complicated thing finally clicked into position. This was not about one struggling ranch. This was about water rights that represented strategic control over a region's agricultural economy. Hollis wasn't waiting for Wyatt to fail because he wanted the land. He was waiting because he wanted what the land controlled. "Does anyone else in the county know this?" she asked. "The other ranchers whose grazing land depends on that water allocation. Do they understand what would happen if this property changed hands?" "I don't think most of them have thought about it." "Then they need to." He looked at her carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that you've been fighting this alone because you thought it was your problem alone." She met his eyes. "It isn't. Every rancher downstream of this property has an interest in what happens here. And Edgar Hollis has been counting on the fact that they don't know that." Wyatt was very still. "If I go to them, we go to them," Clara said. "After February, after we make that payment and take the most immediate pressure off. But before spring, because if Hollis is going to make a move, he'll make it when the winter losses are freshest and the financial pressure is highest." She paused. "Right now we have two jobs. Make the payment and produce enough from the preserved goods to demonstrate that this ranch is generating income, not dying. Can you write to the ranchers? Get word to them that you want to talk. Some of them. The Harlan brothers north of the ridge. Tom Beaumont, not the one in town, his cousin, who runs the grazing operation up by Goose Creek." He paused. "They're not friends of mine, but they're fair men." "Fair is enough. Fair is all we need." The preserved goods operation that Clara had started in her first week on the property became over the next 6 weeks something considerably more significant than the supplementary income stream she'd originally projected. She had begun with what was available, the last of the autumn fruit from the neglected kitchen garden. She'd partly restored the vegetables from the reorganized root cellar, the salt provisions from the supplies they'd brought back from Sheridan. She processed everything methodically in the evenings after the day's outdoor work was done, standing at the stove in the kitchen while Wyatt worked on equipment at the table, and the fire held the cold at bay. She did not talk about what she was doing in terms of money or strategy. She just worked the way she'd worked on the farm in Greene County, with the quiet, competent steadiness of someone who had learned early that the most important things get done by people who show up every day and do them without making a performance of it. But Wyatt noticed. He noticed the row of sealed jars on the shelf, which grew longer every week. He noticed the way she adjusted the seasoning on the salt provisions, based on what she knew of local taste preferences, slightly different from Ohio, more toward the flavors that the territory had developed its own appetite for. He noticed that she kept a ledger of every batch, what went in, what came out, what it cost in materials, what it would sell for, based on the prices she'd checked in Sheridan. One evening, about 3 weeks into this, he put down the bridle he was oiling and said without preamble, "You've done this before, commercially, not just for your own household." She looked up from the jar she was sealing. "My second year running the farm, we had a surplus of tomatoes, and I couldn't get a fair price at market because every other farm had the same surplus at the same time. So I put up 60 jars of tomato preserves and sold them through a dry goods merchant in Xenia at retail markup instead of farm price. Made 3 times what I would have at market." "How old were you?" 21. He was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing this your whole life," he said. "Finding the smarter way when the obvious way doesn't work." "Doesn't everyone?" "No," he said simply, and without elaboration. "They don't." She went back to the jar. But she felt the weight of what he'd said settle around her in the way that honest observation sometimes does not, as flattery, which she'd learned to distrust, because flattery is always about the person giving it, but as something more like acknowledgement. Someone had seen the work clearly, without embellishment and without reduction, and named it for what it was. It was the first time in a long time that had happened. She worked through it in silence, and if something in her posture changed slightly, became less armored, less prepared for the next dismissal. She didn't mention it, and he didn't point it out. The trouble that came in December arrived as trouble generally does, from a direction she hadn't been watching. It was Nora who brought the news riding up the mountain road in weather that made Clara's chest tighten with concern the moment she heard hoofbeats, because nobody rode that road in those conditions without a serious reason. Nora's face when she dismounted said the reason was serious. "Edgar filed a notice," she said without waiting for pleasantries. "With the county clerk. It's not the note he hasn't called the debt, but he's filed a formal inquiry with the Water Rights Board about the status of the creek allocation." Clara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the weather. "On what grounds?" "He's claiming that because the property hasn't been generating adequate commercial income, the water rights allocation should be reviewed for reassignment to a, quote, more productive use." Nora's voice was level, but her jaw was tight. "It's not a legal argument that would normally hold, but the Water Rights Board has 3 members, and Edgar has done business with 2 of them for 20 years. "When is the review?" "March 15th. Clara did the arithmetic instantly. February 1st loan payment. March 15th water rights hearing. 6 weeks between them. 6 weeks to make a payment that established financial credibility, and then build a legal and community argument strong enough to defeat a board that might be predisposed to rule against them. "He moved faster than I expected," she said more to herself than to Nora. "You expected this. I expected something. I didn't know the Water Rights Board was the mechanism." She looked at Wyatt, who was standing with his arms folded, and the particular stillness he had when he was containing something large. "Did you know he could do this?" "I didn't know the board had that kind of discretion over an existing grant. They probably don't legally. But if it goes to a hearing and the board rules in his favor, the challenge costs more to fight than the property is worth to most people." Nora looked at Clara steadily. "Edgar's counting on that. On Wyatt not having the resources to contest a ruling." "He's not counting on me," Clara said. Nora looked at her with the same expression she'd had on the first day. Not quite surprise, moving toward something that looked like it might become genuine admiration if given the right conditions. "What are you going to do?" Nora asked. "I'm going to find out exactly what the Water Rights Board's legal authority is, and what the standard for reassignment requires, and who has standing to contest a reassignment. And then I'm going to make sure every rancher downstream of this creek knows that if those water rights move, their grazing allocation moves with them." She paused. "And I'm going to need a lawyer. Do you know one in Sheridan who isn't in Edgar Hollis's pocket?" Nora stared at her. Then she did something Clara had not seen her do in any of their previous encounters. She laughed, a real laugh, sudden and short with genuine surprise in it. "Yes," she said. "Actually I do. His name is Aldous Crane. He's 72, he's half deaf, and he hasn't lost a property rights case in 30 years. She paused. "And he cannot stand my uncle. Can you get a message to him? I'll ride to Sheridan myself." Clara looked at her. "Why are you doing this? Hollis is your family." Nora met her eyes, and what was in them was not complicated, but it was real. "Because my husband's ranch was one of the properties downstream of this creek. When he died, I sold it to keep his debts clear, but his brother still runs it." She paused. "And because I've watched my uncle arrange things to his advantage for 15 years, and I've always told myself it was just business, and I've been telling myself that long enough that I'm tired of the sound of it." The 3 of them stood in the cold, and the wind and the mountain held them all in its indifferent grip, and what was building between them in that moment was something that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago. An alliance that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted, made of the kind of necessity that turns strangers into something more than strangers. "Go to Sheridan," Clara said. "Tell Crane we need to meet before Christmas, and tell him to bring everything he knows about Water Rights Board authority and the grounds for contesting an allocation review." Nora nodded once and remounted. Clara turned back to Wyatt as the hoofbeats faded. He was watching her with an expression she'd stopped being able to easily categorize. It had too many things in it that she hadn't expected to see and wasn't sure she was reading correctly. "You're not scared," he said. "I'm extremely scared. I'm just not stopping." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, "I know those letters. The Harlan brothers, Beaumont's cousin. The other ranchers. Write them tonight." "I will." A pause. "Clara." She waited. When you came off that mail coach in Pine Ridge. He stopped, started again. What were you hoping for when you came west, before any of this happened? It was the most personal thing he'd asked her. She thought about deflecting and decided against it. I was hoping for a place that needed what I had to offer, she said. Not what I looked like, not whether I fit someone's picture of what a woman should be, just whether I could work and think and contribute something real. She held his gaze. I was hoping someone would ask me the right question before they made up their mind. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. I should have asked the question on the street in Pine Ridge, he said, instead of making assumptions about why you were sitting there. You asked the right one eventually. What question was that? Do you have somewhere to go? She paused. Most people that day were looking at me and seeing a problem. You looked at me and saw a person who might have a problem. That's different. He seemed to take that in. Let it settle. Write the letters, she said, before the moment could become something that neither of them was ready to navigate. We have a payment to make in February and a hearing to win in March, and neither of those things happens by itself. He almost smiled. I'll write the letters. The payment on the Hollis note was made on January 28th, 4 days early, in the full amount required, delivered by Clara herself to the county clerk's office in Pine Ridge, because she was not going to trust it to anyone else, and because she wanted Edgar Hollis to know through whatever network of information he maintained that the payment had been made in person and ahead of schedule. The county clerk was a small, efficient man named Mr. Perkins, who stamped the receipt twice, which Clara had not asked him to do, but appreciated. She was walking back to the cart when she nearly collided with a man coming out of the land office next door. She knew who he was before he introduced himself, because Nora had described him accurately. Mid-60s, well-dressed in the way that money becomes invisible when it's had long enough, with gray eyes that assessed her, the way a land surveyor assesses terrain, calculating, professional, and accustomed to being the smartest person in any given conversation. Miss Whitmore, Edgar Hollis said. She stopped. You know who I am, she said. Not a question. Nora speaks of you. His voice was mild. You've done good work on the coal property. The root cellar reorganization in particular, I heard the details through a mutual acquaintance. Very methodical. Methodical is what works. Indeed. He looked at her with something that was almost avuncular, which she recognized as a form of condescension, so refined it had become polite. I want you to know that I have no personal ill will toward Wyatt Cole. The loan was a business arrangement, and the note review was a legitimate exercise of the board's authority. Was it? A slight pause. I beg your pardon. I've read the Water Rights Board's charter, Mr. Hollis. I've also read the original coal land grant and the relevant statutes governing allocation reviews. I've had correspondence with Aldous Crane of Sheridan, who has opinions about the legal sufficiency of the board's authority to initiate a reassignment review on grounds of commercial productivity. She held his gaze steadily. And I've spoken with 11 ranchers downstream of the creek that runs through the coal property, 8 of whom have indicated they will attend the March hearing and present evidence that a reassignment would materially damage their operations. Edgar Hollis looked at her. For the first time in the conversation, he said nothing immediately. The mild, avuncular expression did not disappear, but something behind it recalibrated. You've been busy, he said finally. I have. She picked up her bag. The payment on the note has been filed with the county clerk. We'll see you in March, Mr. Hollis. She walked back to the cart. She did not look back, but her hands when she picked up the reins were not entirely steady. Because Edgar Hollis was not a man who lost gracefully, and what she had just done demonstrated clearly that she knew his strategy and had already moved to counter it would not make him retreat. It would make him sharpen. And she had 11 ranchers who'd said they would show up at a hearing, and a half-deaf 72-year-old lawyer who hated Edgar Hollis, and a man on a mountain who had stopped walking past when the world decided she wasn't worth looking at twice. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to keep going. The mountain road home was cold and long, and the wind came off the peaks in long, hard gusts that made the cart creak and the horse lay his ears back. Clara drove into it without turning her face away because she had learned growing up in Greene County, running a farm at 19, sitting on a post office step with $4.30, that the wind didn't care if you turned your face away. It hit you anyway. You might as well look at it straight. And that was exactly what Clara did when she walked into the Pine Ridge County Courthouse on the morning of March 15th. Because looking at things straight was the only strategy she had ever found that actually worked, and she was not about to change it on the most important day the Cole Ranch had seen in 4 years. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected, and fuller than Edgar Hollis had probably planned for. She registered both of those facts in the first 3 seconds and filed them away as useful. Wyatt was beside her. He had put on his best shirt, which was clean and pressed, and he had shaved, and he looked like what he was, a man who worked hardland and took serious things seriously. She had noticed him looking at the room when they walked in, counting heads. The way she was counting heads, and she saw the slight change in his posture when he registered who was present. The Harlan brothers were there, both of them standing against the back wall with their hats in their hands and their faces carrying the particular expression of men who had come prepared to be heard and were not planning to leave until they were. Tom Beaumont's cousin, a broad-weathered man named George, who had ridden 40 miles through uncertain March weather to be present, was seated in the second row. There were 8 other ranchers whose names Clara knew from the letters Wyatt had written in December, all of them with water rights that traced back through the creek that ran through the Cole property. 11 ranchers had said they would come. 13 were present. Clara did not let herself feel relief yet. Relief was for after. Aldous Crane was already at the table on their side of the room, and he was exactly what Nora had described, 72 half-deaf, with a hearing trumpet he used selectively, and a stack of papers in front of him that was organized with the meticulous precision of a man who had won 30 years of property cases by never leaving anything to chance. He looked up when Clara sat down beside him and gave her the assessing look of a professional who has been briefed on a situation but withholds final judgment until he's seen the principals in person. Whatever he saw appeared to satisfy him because he turned back to his papers without comment, which Clara had already learned to interpret as his version of approval. Edgar Hollis was across the room with a lawyer from Cheyenne younger than Crane, expensively dressed with the smooth confidence of someone who billed by the hour and had never lost sleep over a client's outcome. He had not looked at Clara since she came in. That she understood was deliberate. The 3 board members took their seats at the front table at precisely 9 o'clock. The chairman was a man named Walter Pratt, 60, deliberate in his movements, with a reputation that Crane had assessed in his letters to Clara as careful but not corrupt, which means he can be reached by evidence even if he can't be reached by argument. The second member, a rancher named Douglas Fitch, had done business with Hollis for over a decade. The third was a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Carver, who owned a sheep operation east of Pine Ridge, and whom nobody had thought to assess in any direction because nobody had thought she mattered. Clara had thought she mattered. She had written to Mrs. Carver 3 weeks ago. She had not told Wyatt about that letter yet. Chairman Pratt called the hearing to order. Hollis's lawyer went first, which was expected, and he was good at it, which was also expected. He presented the commercial productivity argument with the particular elegance of someone who has prepared a case designed to sound reasonable to people who haven't thought about it carefully. The ranch had generated insufficient commercial income over the past 4 years. The water rights allocation was a community resource that carried an implicit obligation to productive use. The board had a responsibility to the broader agricultural community of the county to ensure that critical resources were allocated efficiently. It was, Clara had to admit, well constructed. None of it was technically false. All of it was strategically incomplete. He did not mention, for instance, that the productivity of the Cole Ranch over the past 4 years had been materially affected by operating costs that had been inflated by a supply relationship with a Pine Ridge merchant who had been overcharging by 30%, or that the financial pressure on the property had been sustained in part by a private loan at a rate specifically calibrated to keep the borrower in permanent stress. He did not mention the water rights implications for downstream properties. He spoke for 20 minutes and made it sound like simple resource management, which was the most dangerous kind of dishonesty, the kind that wears the clothing of reason. When he finished, Pratt turned to Crane. Aldous Crane stood up with the deliberateness of a man who has been standing up in front of boards and courts for 50 years and has never once felt the need to hurry on anyone else's account. He adjusted his hearing trumpet in a way that seemed to say he had heard everything he needed to hear and was now prepared to address it. "Chairman Pratt, members of the board," he began. "I want to start with a point of law because everything else we discussed this morning sits on top of it, and if the foundation is wrong, the rest of the structure is immaterial." I then delivered for 11 minutes a precise and entirely unadorned legal analysis of the Water Rights Board's authority under Wyoming Territory statute. His argument was simple and almost insultingly clear. The board had regulatory authority over the allocation of new water rights grants, but it had no statutory power to reassign or review existing grants held under the original land patent system, of which the coal grant was one. The claim that commercial productivity was a grounds for reassignment had no basis in the relevant statutes. None. The board had been asked to exercise authority it did not legally possess. The room was very quiet when he finished. Douglas Fitch, the board member with the Hollis connection, leaned forward. "The board has traditionally exercised broad discretion in tradition is not statute," Crane said pleasantly. "And I am happy to provide the court in Sheridan with the relevant citations if this board's ruling requires them to make that determination." He paused. "Though I suspect this board prefers to avoid that particular process." The meaning was entirely clear. If the board ruled in Hollis's favor and Crane appealed, which he would, the case would go before a territorial court, where the board's lack of statutory authority would be examined publicly in detail, and with consequences for every ruling the board had ever made on similar grounds. Pratt's expression did not change, but his pen had stopped moving. Then Clara stood up. And that was the part nobody had expected. Crane had not planned it. Hollis's lawyer had not planned for it. Even Wyatt, sitting at the table beside her, went still with something between alarm and surprise when she rose from her chair. But she had prepared for this. She had prepared for it for 6 weeks. "Chairman Pratt," she said, "I'd like to address the board on the question of the ranch's commercial productivity, since that is the grounds on which this review was initiated." Pratt looked at her with the particular expression of a man assessing whether the procedural rules allowed him to stop her, and then apparently concluding that they didn't. "You may proceed, Miss Whitmore, Clara Whitmore. I manage the operational affairs of the coal ranch." She put her ledger on the table. Not the original battered box of paper scraps and faded receipts. The new ledger. The one she had been maintaining since her first week on the property, in her small, precise hand, every transaction recorded and categorized and totaled. Between October of last year and today, the coal ranch has reduced its operating costs by 31% through renegotiated supply arrangements, improved storage management, and elimination of waste in the livestock feed allocation. She kept her voice level and her pace deliberate, the way she'd learned to speak when she needed people to stay with the numbers instead of drifting. In the same period, we have generated supplementary income from preserved goods sales in the amount of $63.40, with an additional order placed by the Morrison General Store for spring delivery. She heard someone in the back of the room shift a small sound, but it meant someone was paying attention. The loan held by Mr. Edgar Hollis was paid in full as of the scheduled January installment date 4 days early. The principal balance has been reduced by a payment that exceeds the minimum requirement by 15%. She looked up from the ledger. "I would suggest to this board that a property which has reduced its operating costs by nearly a third, created a new income stream, and made early loan payments is not a property that meets any reasonable definition of commercially insufficient." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the February wind finding the gaps in the courthouse walls. Hollis's lawyer cleared his throat. "The board might note that the figures presented here represent a very recent period of operation, and they represent the period during which the property was under active management," Clara said without raising her voice. "Prior to that period, management was insufficient. That is not a secret. But the question before this board is the current and projected status of the property's productivity, not its past difficulties, which were circumstantial and have been addressed." Pratt looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at Douglas Fitch, who was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has realized that the version of events he came in prepared to support has just been made significantly more complicated in front of a room full of witnesses. Then Pratt looked at Mrs. Elspeth Carver. Mrs. Carver, who had said nothing yet, sat up slightly in her chair. She was a compact woman with gray hair and the steady eyes of someone who had run a sheep operation alone for 12 years and had no patience for theater. "I have a question for the board," she said, and her voice was clear and carried about process rather than substance. Pratt nodded. Was any member of this board made aware prior to this hearing of the relationship between the filing party and the property under review? A pause. "I'm not sure I follow, Mrs. Carver. The coal property holds water rights that affect the creek allocation for 13 properties downstream." She let that number sit for a moment. "Several of the owners of those properties are present today. The filing party, Mr. Hollis, holds financial and commercial interests in 2 of those downstream properties, the Morrison Store water allocation and the Fitch grazing lease." She looked at Douglas Fitch with the patient directness of a woman who had stopped being polite about things that mattered some years ago. "That represents a potential conflict of interest in this board's composition that I believe should have been disclosed before today's proceedings began." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones that had come before it. This one had weight in it. The particular weight of a room full of people who have just realized that the ground has shifted under everyone's feet simultaneously. Douglas Fitch's face had gone a particular shade of careful blankness. Edgar Hollis across the room did not move. But Clara watched his hands which had been flat on the table in front of him, with the relaxed confidence of a man who expects to win, had tightened slightly at the knuckles. She had written to Mrs. Carver 3 weeks ago. She had not known exactly how or when Elspeth Carver would use the information she'd provided about the board's compositions and the downstream allocation. She had trusted the woman to find the right moment. The right moment had just arrived. The hearing recessed at 11 o'clock, which Crane had predicted would happen, and Hollis's lawyer had apparently not. During the recess, the ranchers in the back of the room collected themselves into a cluster in the hallway, and there was conversation that Clara was not close enough to hear, but whose general tenor she could read from the gestures and the expressions, men who had come prepared to testify, and were now processing the fact that the nature of what they'd walked into was considerably more complex than a simple productivity review. George Beaumont found her in the hallway. "The water allocation," he said without preamble. "If Hollis got the property, he'd control the upstream allocation." "Yes." "And we would be negotiating your water access with a man who has a history of structuring agreements to his own long-term advantage." She met his eyes. "You understand why I wrote to you?" Beaumont was quiet for a moment, working through implications that were rearranging his understanding of why he'd made a 40-mile ride in March weather. "My father told me to keep an eye on that creek," he said finally. "I thought he meant the water table. I didn't understand what he actually meant." "He meant exactly this. You figured it out in what, 6 weeks?" 4 days. I needed 6 weeks to build a response." He looked at her with something that was not quite admiration and not quite bewilderment, and combined both into an expression. She was becoming familiar with the look of a person who has just updated their understanding of what another person is capable of. Wyatt was standing at the end of the hallway, talking with the Harlan brothers, and he glanced at her across the space between them. Just a glance, a quick specific look of the kind that people exchange when they have been in close quarters for long enough to develop a private language of small gestures. This one said, "Are you all right?" She gave him a slight nod. He turned back to the Harlans. It occurred to her not for the first time that she had stopped noticing the strangeness of being understood by someone without words. When it had started, she couldn't have said precisely, but she had stopped bracing for the moment when he would stop paying attention, which meant she had at some point quietly, and without announcing it to herself, stopped believing that moment was coming. That was new. For her, it was very new. She filed it away. There was still a hearing to win. Chatting. The recess lasted 40 minutes, which was longer than Crane had expected. When the board returned, Pratt's expression had changed in the way that expressions change when someone has had a difficult conversation during a recess and come out of it having made a decision they didn't particularly enjoy making. The board has considered the procedural question raised by Mrs. Carver. Pratt said. "Mr. Fitch has agreed to recuse himself from the remainder of this proceeding due to the conflict of interest identified. In the interest of the hearing's integrity, we will proceed with 2 board members and allow the record to reflect the circumstances." Douglas Fitch left the table without looking at anyone in the room. Edgar Hollis, across the room, looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked back. Something passed between them that was invisible to everyone else, but legible to Clara, because she had been watching Hollis's face for the past 2 hours, and she could read what it looked like when a plan encountered an obstacle it hadn't accounted for. The plan had just encountered 2. The testimony from the downstream ranchers took most of the afternoon, and it was not theatrical. These were working men who spoke plainly and accounted for their water usage in the direct, specific language of people whose livelihood actually depends on understanding exactly how many gallons of allocation they receive per week, and what happens to their herds if that number changes. The Harlan brothers testified that their upper grazing pasture would not support cattle without the creek allocation. George Beaumont testified that his grandfather's original homestead selection had been made specifically because of the downstream water availability from the Coal Creek. A man named Patterson, who ran a small dairy operation south of Pine Ridge, brought documentation showing the correlation between creek flow in spring and his annual milk yield. It was not dramatic testimony. It was better than dramatic. It was credible, specific, and consistent, the kind of record that is very difficult to argue against, because it has no weak points of exaggeration to attack. Hollis's lawyer tried briefly to challenge the relevance of downstream impact to a hearing about upstream productivity. Crane responded that the downstream impact was directly relevant to the board's responsibility to consider the broader agricultural community, which was the exact framing Hollis had used to initiate the review in the first place, and suggested that perhaps the board might want to consider whether a review initiated on community benefit grounds could reasonably proceed without considering community impact. Pratt's mouth did something that was almost a smile. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Clara was exhausted in a way that went all the way down to the bone. She had been awake since 5 that morning, running through every possible contingency in her mind, and the day had been longer and more demanding than even her most pessimistic preparation. But the exhaustion was clean, the kind that comes from effort that has gone in the right direction even before you know the result. The board deliberated for 30 minutes. When Pratt returned to the table, his face told Clara nothing, which was itself a kind of information. A man who had made an easy decision would have relaxed by now, and his face was not relaxed. "The board finds," he said, "that the water rights allocation attached to the coal land grant falls outside the scope of the board's authority to review or reassign under existing statute. The petition filed by Mr. Hollis is therefore dismissed for lack of jurisdictional standing." A sound went through the room, not quite noise, but the collective exhale of 14 people whose tension has just been released simultaneously. "Furthermore," Pratt continued, and the room went quiet again. "The board notes for the record that the circumstances surrounding the initiation of this review have raised questions that this board considers worth examining in our next scheduled session. The record of today's proceedings will be submitted to the Territorial Attorney's Office as a matter of routine disclosure." That last sentence was not routine. Everyone in the room knew it was not routine. Edgar Hollis knew it. He stood up, said something quiet to his lawyer, and left the room with the composed dignity of a man who has decided that composure is the last thing he has complete control over. He did not look at Clara. He did not look at Wyatt. He walked out with his eyes forward and his back straight, and the door closed behind him without drama. Nora, who had been sitting in the back row and had not testified but had been present for every moment, watched her uncle leave. Her face was unreadable for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara, and what was in that look was not simple. Clara held it. She understood. Winning a thing and living with what winning it costs are 2 different processes, and Nora was already in the middle of the second one. She gave Nora a small nod. Nora looked away. Outside the courthouse, in the cold March air, with the last of the afternoon light coming off the mountains at a low angle, Wyatt stood beside Clara and looked at the street and said nothing for a long time. She let the silence run. She'd learned in 5 months on this mountain that his silences were not empty, they were where he did his real thinking. "Crane's bill," he said finally. "Manageable." He agreed to a payment schedule. "The Hollis note is paid." "Yes." "The water rights are secure." "For now. There may be other attempts. But we've put a record in front of the Territorial Attorney's Office, and we have 13 ranchers who understand what's at stake. That changes the calculation for anyone who wants to try again." He turned and looked at her directly, which he did less often than he once had, not because he'd become more distant, but because closeness had replaced the need for the formal gesture of eye contact. Looking at someone is how you try to know them. When you know them, you don't have to try as hard. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "When I stopped on that street in Pine Ridge in October, I told myself I was doing it because it was right. Because what I was seeing was wrong, and someone should do something about it." He paused. "That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. What was the rest of it? I was looking for a reason to believe that something could be different." He said it plainly without a performance, which was the only way he ever said anything that mattered. "I had been running that ranch alone for 4 years, and I had stopped being able to see a way forward, and I had gotten very good at not noticing that I couldn't see it." He looked at the mountain road that led back to the property. "You didn't just fix the ranch, Clara. You fixed the way I was looking at it." She stood with that for a moment. "You did the work," she said. "We did the work." She looked at him. 5 months of work and weather and difficult mornings, and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have been in close quarters through a hard winter, and learned each other's habits and rhythms and silences. 5 months of someone who had listened when she spoke, and followed when she led and pushed back when he disagreed, and never once made her feel like her presence on that property was conditional on being smaller or quieter or less certain than she was. It was the thing she had been trying not to count on, because she had learned early that things you count on have a way of disappearing before you're done needing them. "Wyatt." She stopped. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to respond to that right now. I know you're not." She found the words carefully because they were important, and she was not willing to get them wrong. "I came west looking for a place that needed what I had to offer. Not what I looked like. Not whether I fit someone's idea of what a woman should be." She met his eyes. "I found it. I want you to know that I know I found it." He looked at her with the steadiness that was one of the things she had come to trust most about him, the quality of being a person who does not flinch from things that matter. "Is that all?" he asked. She almost smiled. "No, but it's what I can say clearly right now." He nodded once slowly. The particular nod of a man who has waited for something and has just learned that waiting was the right decision and is prepared to keep waiting as long as patience is what the situation requires. "Then we go home," he said. And that word home landed in Clara's chest with the full force of everything it had cost her to get here. The 900 miles, and the 7 rejections, and the $4.30, and the cold post office steps, and the root cellar, and the Hollis note, and the courtroom this afternoon. She had not had a home since the bank took the farm in Ohio. She had not said the word in relation to a place she stood in for 3 years. "Yes," she said, "we go home." The cart ride back up the mountain road was long and cold, and neither of them said very much because the day had used up most of what talking could do, and the rest of it was in the air between them, in the particular quality of a silence that is not empty, but full. Full of things that have been understood without being spoken, and things that are waiting for the right moment to be spoken, and the specific peace of being in the company of someone with whom silence has become, without either of you quite deciding it, a form of conversation. The ranch came into view as the last light left the sky. The small log house, the barn with the repaired south fence, the root cellar in the hillside reorganized and stocked, the kitchen garden that would be ready for the first planting when the ground thawed in another 6 weeks. Not a grand property, not a simple one. A place that had nearly been lost and had been pulled back inch by inch through the specific work of people who refused to walk away from difficult things. Clara looked at it in the last of the light, and she felt for the first time in a very long time the thing she had been trying not to hope for. She was where she was supposed to be. That was not a small thing. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. And Clara Whitmore woke the next morning knowing it with a certainty that sat differently in her chest than any certainty she had carried before, because this one had been earned through the full length of what it costs to refuse to become smaller than you are. She was up before dawn the way she had been every morning since October. The fire needed building. The animals needed feeding. The ledger needed updating. The preserved goods order from Morrison's store, the one she had negotiated herself with a man who had watched 7 families turn her away and said nothing needed to be prepared for delivery by the end of the week. Life on the coal ranch did not pause to acknowledge its own turning points, and she had come to respect that about it. The mountain didn't care what had happened in a courtroom yesterday. The cattle needed water this morning regardless. She was measuring coffee when Wyatt came out of his room, and the look on his face was the one she'd learned to read as his version of waking up still carrying something from the night before. "You slept," she said. Not a question. "Some." He went to the stove and stood beside it with his hands out to the heat. "You didn't." "I slept enough." "Clara." She kept measuring the coffee. "I was thinking." "About what?" "About what comes next." She set the coffee pot on the stove. "We won yesterday. That's real, and it matters. But we have 6 weeks until the first planting window, and the south pasture fence still needs a full rebuild, not just the temporary brace from November. The Morrison order is 62 jars, and I have 47 ready. The Harlan brothers asked about purchasing preserved goods directly, rather than through town, which is worth exploring, because the margin is better on direct sale." She turned to look at him. "I've been thinking about all of that." He watched her for a moment. "And nothing else." She held his gaze. "And some other things. But those were the thoughts I could do something useful with at 4 in the morning." He almost smiled. It was the particular almost smile she'd catalogued over 5 months, the one that appeared when she said something he found both accurate and slightly evasive, and he appreciated both qualities simultaneously. "The Hollis situation," he said, moving to the table and sitting down. "What do you think he does next?" "Nothing immediately. The territorial attorney's office having that record changes his exposure. He's not a man who takes unnecessary risks when the scrutiny is high." She sat across from him. "But he's also not a man who accepts a loss as permanent. I think we have a year, maybe 18 months before he tries something else, something more indirect. And when he does, we'll be in a stronger position than we were yesterday. The downstream ranchers know what's at stake now. Crane is willing to be retained on a continuing basis." She paused. "And we'll know it's coming, which is the most important thing. He lost yesterday partly because he assumed we didn't understand his strategy. He won't make that assumption again." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly. "You've already thought through his next move." "I've thought through 4 possible next moves, and the response to each of them." He looked at her across the table in the early morning light, and what was in that look was something she'd stopped trying to categorize because it was too large and too specific for any single word. It was the look of a man who has found in a place he never expected to find it exactly what he needed, and who is still not entirely accustomed to the fact that it stayed. "Clara," he said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "Not about the ranch." She waited again because this was Wyatt, and pushing him never produced anything faster than letting him arrive at his own pace. He put down the coffee cup. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I know what you came west looking for. You told me on the street in Pine Ridge. And I know that what you found here is real work, and a real place, and a real purpose. And I would never want to suggest that those things aren't enough on their own because they are. But," she said quietly, "but I want to know if there's room in what you're building here for something that isn't about the ranch." He said it directly the way he said everything that mattered, without embellishment, without the performance of vulnerability that isn't actually vulnerable. "I'm not a man who talks about things like this easily. I want you to know that I know that about myself, and I'm saying it anyway, because I think you deserve a direct question more than you deserve me working up to it for another month." Clara looked at him across the table in the kitchen that she had reorganized and warmed and made functional in the house that had been a failing structure and was now something that held people against the cold in the life that she had built here out of $4.30, and everything she knew and everything she was. "Wyatt Cole," she said, "you are the only person who has ever asked me the right question before deciding what they thought about me." "Is that a yes?" "That's a context," she said. "The yes is separate." A pause, and then because she had spent 5 months on this mountain, learning that honest was the only language that worked between them. Yes. The word changed the texture of the days that followed, though it didn't change their shape. They still rose before dawn. The fence still needed rebuilding. The preserved goods order still needed filling. The ledger still needed daily attention. But something in the quality of the work shifted not toward ease, because the mountain didn't offer ease, but toward a kind of wholeness that Clara had not felt in years and had stopped expecting. She noticed it in small things. The way he handed her coffee in the morning now, which was the same physical action it had always been, and carried a weight it hadn't carried before. The way she stopped leaving the storage room door partially open at night, out of the habit of sleeping in a place where she wasn't certain of her welcome. The way they argued about the fence rebuild, he wanted to use the old post method he knew, and she had a newer approach she'd seen used in Ohio that required less replacement lumber over time, and the argument was real, and neither of them moved quickly, and they reached a solution that used his local knowledge and her structural logic, and was better than either original position would have been. That more than anything else was what she had been looking for, without knowing it, had a name. Nora came by the second week of April, which was not unusual. She had become a regular presence over the months. Not a friend exactly, not yet, but something moving in that direction with the careful deliberateness of two women who had learned to be self-sufficient and were practicing the unfamiliar art of trusting another person. She sat down at Clara's kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked around the room with the expression of someone who is cataloging change. "My uncle withdrew the filing with the territorial attorney's office," she said. "He had his lawyer submit a notice of voluntary withdrawal and a statement that the original petition had been filed in error." Clara set down her cup. "When?" "3 days ago. I didn't come sooner because I wanted to think about what it meant first." "What does it mean?" Nora turned her cup slowly. "It means he's cutting his losses. Edgar doesn't fight on ground that costs more than it's worth. The territorial scrutiny was too much exposure, and the downstream ranchers being organized is a variable he can't control." She paused. "It also means he's going to redirect that energy somewhere else. He has other properties, other interests. He'll find a different place to apply pressure." "Not here. Not here. Not for a while." A pause. "I want to say something to you, Clara, and I want you to know it isn't easy for me to say." "Go ahead." "When you arrived in Pine Ridge in October, I heard about it through Greta Mercier, like everyone else, 7 families, the woman from the agency. I didn't think much about it. I thought it was ordinary. The kind of thing that happens and nobody particularly notices." Nora looked at her directly. "I was wrong about that. And I was wrong about why nobody particularly noticed. They didn't notice because they'd decided before looking that it wasn't worth noticing, and I'd done the same thing." Clara held the admission carefully, the way you hold something that someone has offered at a real cost. "You came up that mountain road in November, when you didn't have to," Clara said. "You warned us about your uncle when it would have been easier not to. And you were in that courtroom yesterday doing a thing that cost you something personal." She met Nora's eyes. "I think you noticed sooner than you're giving yourself credit for." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Then Wyatt is a lucky man." "We're fortunate," Clara said. "That's different." Nora smiled, a real one, not the composed professional expression she used by default. "Yes," she agreed. "I suppose it is." The spring planting began the last week of April, and it was the first time Clara felt the full potential of the land under her hands, rather than just the damage that had been done to it by years of neglect. The kitchen garden had been cleared and turned in early March before the last frost, and the soil was ready, in a way that good soil is always ready when it has been properly prepared. Dark and friable and alive with the organisms that do their work in the dark, and ask for nothing except not to be poisoned. She planted what she knew would grow at this elevation and in this soil type. Not everything she'd grown in Ohio. The seasons were different, and the altitude changed what was possible. But potatoes, which were reliable and versatile and calorically dense in a way that mattered through a Wyoming winter. Turnips and parsnips for the root cellar. Kale, which was hardier than people gave it credit for. Onions and garlic, which kept long if stored right. And in the section of the garden that got the best southern exposure and the most protected from the wind, she planted tomatoes. Not because the odds were certain, the elevation made it a gamble every year, but because she had promised herself somewhere in the middle of that first hard winter that if they made it to spring, she was going to plant tomatoes, and she was not in the habit of breaking promises to herself. Wyatt came out to where she was working in the garden one afternoon in early May, and stood at the edge of it and looked at the rows of emerging seedlings with the expression of a man trying to remember the last time this ground produced something. "When did your mother last garden here?" Clara asked without looking up from the row she was thinning. "Before I was 10. She had a kitchen garden, not this large." "What did she grow?" He thought about it. "Beans, squash, some root vegetables. She tried tomatoes once. The frost got them in August." "Mine might make it. The south exposure here is better than I expected." He crouched down beside the row she was working and looked at the seedlings with the same attention he gave to young cattle assessing health without sentiment. "They're strong. They need another 3 weeks before they go into the ground. I'm hardening them off." He nodded. He stayed crouched beside the row for a moment. "My mother would have liked you," he said. She was not a woman who had patience for people who made small of themselves. Clara kept working. "I'll take that as the highest compliment." "It is." He stood up. "The Harlan brothers are coming next week about the direct purchase arrangement. You'll want to be in that conversation." "I'll be in it. I know." He paused. "I never used to involve anyone else in those conversations. It was always just me in a room with whoever I was dealing with, and whatever I understood about the numbers was whatever we were working with. And now I understand why that was a problem." He looked down at her. "You'll want to set the price on the direct sale. You know the margins better than I do." She looked up at him. "We'll set it together." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the particular nod that she'd long since learned was his version of something much larger, and went back to the barn. She went back to the seedlings. The afternoon settled around her warm and quiet, in the way of Wyoming spring days, when the wind lays down, and the mountains hold the heat, and the only sounds were the birds, and the distant sound of Wyatt working in the barn, and the small sounds of the soil doing what soil does when it's been given the chance. She had planted tomatoes that probably wouldn't make it. She had planted them anyway. That felt right. The letter arrived in mid-May, and it arrived with the particular irony of things that come too late from the Columbus Correspondence Agency. It was an apology. The agency had learned through some chain of complaint or inquiry that the letter did not fully explain that their placement process for Clara's case had been conducted improperly. Multiple simultaneous placement attempts without disclosure. Families selected without adequate vetting. The agency was sorry for the distress this had caused. They were enclosing a refund of her placement fee. $2. Clara read the letter twice. Then she put it on the table and went back to what she'd been doing, which was totaling the month's accounts. Wyatt came in later and saw the letter and read it. He stood at the table with it in his hand for a moment. $2, he said. "Yes." How do you feel about this?" She considered the question. "I think I feel like it's the right kind of ending for that particular chapter," she said. "The agency did something wrong, and they know it, and they said so. That's more than most people manage." She paused. "And if they hadn't done it wrong, if the placement had been made correctly, and one of those 7 families had accepted me before I sat down on those post office steps..." She stopped. He looked at her. "Then none of this," she said simply. He set the letter down. "None of this," he said quietly. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The kitchen held the sound of the fire and the spring wind outside and the distant sound of the cattle. And Clara sat at the table with the month's accounts, and Wyatt stood at the table with a letter that had arrived $2 and 7 months too late to matter. And the understanding that passed between them in that silence was the kind that doesn't need words, because it has already been built into the structure of the days they have been living. She folded the letter and set it aside. The April total is up 40% over October, she said. The direct sale arrangement with the Harlans adds $12 a month to the base, if we hold that rate through summer and the preserved goods production scales. The way I expect we should have the operating reserve fully funded before winter. And the Hollis note is finished. Yes, that's finished. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I want to talk about something. She looked up. I want to file an amendment to the property deed, he said, adding your name. She was very still. I've thought about it carefully, he continued in the measured way of a man who does not make proposals lightly. Not as a gesture, not as gratitude, as an accurate reflection of what this property is and who it belongs to. You have put as much into this land as anyone who has ever held the title to it. The root cellar, the supply accounts, the garden, the income streams, the legal defense. He met her eyes. The water rights. This place stands because of what you built here. The deed should reflect that. Clara looked at him across the table for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a mail coach in October with a worn travel bag and $4.30 and a letter that had turned out to be worthless. She thought about 7 gates and 7 polite or impolite versions of the same fundamental dismissal. She thought about a post office step and a man who had stopped when everyone else had kept walking, and the root cellar in the dark, with a lantern between them, and the Sheridan supply account, and the courtroom, and the tomato seedlings in the kitchen garden that might or might not survive the August frost. She had come west looking for a place that needed what she had to offer. She had found considerably more than that, and she had built considerably more than she'd planned, and the person sitting across from her had seen it clearly from the beginning and had offered her room and board and a fair shot, and then slowly, and without performance, everything else. Yes, she said, I'd like that. The deed amendment was filed with the county clerk's office on a Thursday in early June. Mr. Perkins stamped it twice, the same way he'd stamped the Hollis payment receipt, and Clara had the feeling that he did it deliberately both times, a small, quiet act of witness to things that deserved to be witnessed. Word moved through Pine Ridge, the way word always moved through small towns, faster than anyone who originated it intended, and with a momentum that could not be recalled once started. By Saturday, it had reached the general store, the saloon, the church, and at least 3 of the families who had turned Clara away at their gates in October. Caleb Alderman. The first one found Wyatt at the feed merchant on Saturday morning and attempted a conversation that was clearly designed to be friendly, but carried the weight of a man who is aware he was wrong and hasn't decided how to say so directly. Wyatt let him talk for a moment. Then he said, "Is there something you want to say, Caleb?" Alderman turned his hat in his hands. "I heard about the water rights hearing. Heard she organized the ranchers. Heard about the Hollis note." A pause. "I didn't when I met her in October, I didn't." "I know what you didn't do," Wyatt said. Not cruelly, but clearly. "She knows it too. She's not holding it." "Is she, would she?" "I'd like to apologize, if she'd receive it." "That's between you and her. I can't speak for her on that." Alderman nodded. He seemed to understand that this was the right answer, and also that it was the limit of what he was going to get, and that the limit was fair. Clara was at the supply account table at the back of the merchants when Alderman found her. She saw him coming, and she did not make it easy or hard. She simply looked at him and waited, because she had learned that waiting was usually more honest than talking. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. He was not a bad man, she had understood that from the beginning. He was a man who had not looked carefully, and had let assumption do the work that attention should have done, and the result had been a harm that he hadn't intended, but had caused regardless. "I accept it," she said. He seemed to have been prepared for more, for conditions or anger or a longer reckoning. The simplicity of it appeared to catch him sideways. "That's thank you," he said. "I mean it. I know you do." She turned back to the supply account. "Mr. Alderman, The best apology for a thing like that is to look at the next person you're about to decide about before you've asked them a question. That's all. He nodded once slowly and left. She went back to the numbers. The summer came in hard and bright and full of the kind of work that builds a life rather than just sustaining it. The fence along the south pasture was rebuilt with Wyatt's local knowledge and Clara's structural approach, and the result standing 8 inches taller and using 15% less lumber than either original plan, which pleased them both, and they didn't make a competition of whose contribution had been larger because they'd passed that particular milestone sometime in February without noticing. The Harlan brothers became regular customers. George Beaumont's cousin brought 2 neighboring operations into the preserved goods arrangement. By August, Clara was managing supply contracts for 4 different ranches, in addition to the coal operation itself, and the income it generated had moved from supplementary to structural money that built the reserve rather than just covering the operating costs. The tomatoes made it to August. They were not certain they would survive the first frost, and they did not pretend otherwise, but they were there, full and red and real, and she picked them on the morning of August 10th, because the weather said the frost was 3 days away, and she was not going to lose them to stubbornness when there was a full cellar waiting. She brought a bowl of them inside and set them on the kitchen table. Wyatt came in from the barn and stopped. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she recognized as the particular emotion of a person encountering an unexpected grace. Something that arrived and made the world slightly larger than it had been the moment before. "You did it," he said. "We have a south-facing exposure and this year's heat came early. It won't work every year." "It worked this year." "Yes." She looked at the bowl. "It worked this year." They stood together in the kitchen that they had shared through a winter that had tried to beat them, and a spring that had rebuilt them, and a summer that had established them, and the tomatoes sat on the table between them, like the particular proof of a thing that everyone had said was unlikely, not impossible, not forbidden, just unlikely, and had happened anyway. That autumn. When the mail coach came through Pine Ridge, there was no one stepping off it with a worn travel bag and a worthless letter and nowhere to go. The station platform was ordinary. The afternoon was ordinary. The town moved around its own concerns without drama. But in the hardware store, a young woman from the agency was waiting nervously with a letter of introduction and the specific terrified hope of someone who has staked everything on a stranger's decision. Clara was in town for the supply account. She saw the young woman through the window, the held straight posture, the careful expression, the travel bag that said everything about how far she'd come and how little she had to fall back on. She went inside. The young woman looked up. She was perhaps 22, slight with anxious eyes that had already started preparing for another disappointment. Clara sat down beside her. "How long have you been waiting?" she asked. "Since this morning." A pause. "The family I was supposed to meet sent word that they changed their minds." "Before they met you?" "Yes." Clara looked at her for a moment. The particular economy of that story, the familiar one, the one she knew the shape of from the inside. "What's your name?" "Anna. Anna Marsh." "Anna. My name is Clara Cole. I own a property with my husband about 8 miles up the mountain road, and we have no positions currently available, but I know 7 other operations in this county that are looking for capable hands and are run by people who ask questions before they make decisions." She reached into her bag for her ledger and tore a clean sheet from the back. "Let me write down some names." Anna Marsh looked at her with the expression of someone who has been preparing for disappointment long enough that an unexpected kindness requires a moment to register as real. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. Clara looked up from the page she was writing on. "I know you came 900 miles on your own resources to try to build something," she said. "I know you're still sitting here instead of crying on a platform somewhere. And I know you didn't break when the first bad thing happened today." She handed the young woman the list. "That tells me something." Anna Marsh looked at the list. Then she looked at Clara. Then something in her face changed. Not relief exactly, but the thing that comes before relief, which is the moment when a person realizes that the next thing is still possible. "Thank you," she said. Clara stood up and picked up her bag. "Come find me if none of those work out," she said. "We'll think of something else." She walked out into the street where the October air had the same cold edge it had carried a year ago, and the mountains sat above the town with the same indifferent permanence, and she found Wyatt waiting with the cart at the end of the street, because he always met her at the end of the street when she came to town for the supply account, and she climbed up beside him, and he asked without asking the particular look, and she said, "There was a young woman. I gave her some contacts." He looked at her for a moment, reading what was in her face, with the fluency of a man who has spent a year learning the language. "Like someone stopped for you," he said. "Something like that." He took up the reins. The cart moved. The mountain road rose ahead of them in the late afternoon light, and they went up it together, the way they went up everything now, which was side by side with the full weight of what they knew about each other, and what they had built together, and what they would keep building for as many seasons as the mountain chose to give them. The woman. 7 families had turned away. At 7 gates had become the woman who held the deed to the land. The account at Sheridan, the water rights that protected a county, and the knowledge that the thing everyone had decided about her in a single glance had been the most comprehensively wrong decision, made by the most comprehensively inattentive collection of people she had ever had the privilege of proving incorrect. She had not needed any of them to be right about her. She had only needed one person to stop and ask the right question. And she had answered it with everything she had, and everything she had turned out to be exactly enough.